Hello, and welcome to Hospice Yukon's 2020 Lights of Life opening ceremony. My name is Elaine Schimann. I'm a client and a volunteer for Hospice Yukon, and I'm your host for this ceremony. The Lights of Life ceremony is a well-loved Yukon tradition. Normally, we gather in the atrium of the Elijah Smith Building on Main Street in Whitehorse. We come alone or with a family member or friend. We remember our loved ones who have died. We listen to music and words that comfort us. We shed some tears. We are surrounded by the supporting presence of others. This year marks our 30th year of the Lights of Life, and like so many things in 2020, it's different. We are unable to hold a live in-person ceremony, so we've made this video to help you take part in Lights of Life wherever you may be. Despite all the changes this year has brought, Hospice Yukon is grateful that we are still able to have our Lights of Life trees available for Yukoners. Although we can't share time and space together in the same way as in the past, this video is a reminder that many others are still joining you in the spirit of remembrance to mark this special time of year and to think about the unique challenges that grief and loss bring to the holiday season, and the special challenges that 2020 has brought for all of us. Our ceremony still includes poetry, beautiful music, and some thoughts from our guest speaker, Megan Slobodin. There is information at the end about the Lights of Life trees, both in Whitehorse and in other communities, who we are able to reach in a very inclusive way this year through this video. For us, that is a silver lining. We invite you to help us make this ceremony special in whatever ways might be meaningful to you. Perhaps by lighting a candle, or holding a photo or memento of your loved one, or by finding a spot in your home that is special to you, maybe beside your own Christmas tree. I want to gratefully acknowledge that we are filming this ceremony on the traditional lands of the Kwanlundun First Nation and the Tonquichan Council, lands that hold a great depth of First Nation history and stewardship and stories. In that light, Hospice Yukon is very much a newcomer, and we're grateful to have reached our 30th year of Lights of Life ceremonies in the Yukon. 30 years of Decembers, a month when families, friends, neighbors, and colleagues come together to relax, enjoy good food, and relish each other's company. 30 years of Decembers when some of us have felt the absence of the ones who have left us, who no longer share these moments. So, in addition to joy and celebration, sadness and grief is also part of what this season brings. That's why Hospice Yukon offers Lights of Life and this ceremony. We make space for our grief, and we make space for the love and memories we have shared. This year, many of us have had to accept losses of various kinds, isolation and distance from those we love, celebrations that were diminished or completely canceled. And those who lost loved ones this year may not have been able to gather to support each other in the way that we usually do. Many of us are looking for some joy and some peace. This song by the Joy Waters Memorial Choir, under the direction of Barbara Chamberlin, is called Dona Nobis Pacem, which means, give us peace. Our guest speaker for this year's ceremony is Megan Slobodin. In 2019, Megan lost her husband, Brent, after 38 years of marriage. She was still in her first tumultuous year of grief when the coronavirus struck and brought even more loss. Megan has been reading and writing about grief throughout this time, and she will share some of her thoughts on grief in the time of COVID.
My name is Megan Slobodin, and I am honored to participate in this year's Lights of Life ceremony hosted by Hospice Yukon. I live in Whitehorse, where I arrived 32 years ago with my husband, Brent. We raised our sons here, enjoyed our lives, and eventually retired. Just over a year and a half ago, my husband of 38 years became ill and passed away quite unexpectedly, and it set me suddenly on the path that brings most of us to participate in this ceremony today. At last year's ceremony, I couldn't have spoken, for I was barely half a year into the most profound loss of my life. I wasn't sure I could even attend this celebration, as I was still struggling on a daily basis to find my bearings and grieving deeply. Grief, as I found, is our response to unspeakable loss. But grief is also a spectrum. It is our response as well to the smaller losses that we all experience throughout our lives, most of which we don't acknowledge or process, but send underground, bury inside, or try to move on from stoically. We are typically a society that doesn't openly acknowledge its personal losses. We often don't learn how to deal with these losses. We push our complicated feelings about them deep inside, and we don't easily or willingly share how we feel with others. So when something truly catastrophic happens in our lives, we are often quite unprepared to handle it. And when it happens to someone else, we're not sure how to meet that momentous experience with the compassion that arises naturally within us. This year of the COVID pandemic has accentuated all of that for all of us. And I hope our collective experiences of loss under the pandemic have finally made it impossible not to talk about the effects of grief on our lives. For COVID has been the great leveler in our society by providing new and unexpected losses to grieve, as well as challenges to how we are able to mourn them. We lost people, family and friends who would still be here if not for the virus. Some of us lost our good health and expectations of standard healthcare. Some of us lost our livelihood and with it lost the confidence to pay our bills and to put food on the table for our families. We were locked down and lost our sense of freedom. We lost that innocent sense of invulnerability to move about freely in our own society, at work, to school and daycare, in stores, restaurants, at church, and at our usual gathering places. Most starkly, we lost our sense of safety with the impossible horror that the hazards from the virus are potentially carried to us by the very people we most need to be with in times of grief. Life in the pandemic has also changed our ways of mourning our losses, for we are now greatly diminished in our ability to comfort and be comforted. When our lost people passed under the pandemic, our ability to gather together, to honor and remember them, was and continues to be limited or denied. Our traditions to gather, to celebrate, and our basic ways of comforting each other, of holding each other, of sitting with each other and simply witnessing the ravages of grief have all been greatly diminished or eliminated. All of this makes the grief journey so much more difficult for us to navigate, as our need to open ourselves to comfort from others arises even while having to maintain our physical distance from them. Our very inability to mourn openly and receive comfort from others in our grief in itself becomes a fresh loss and an additional source of grief. These can be unfathomable, but we must not let them become unspeakable. I have well learned that grief is a journey that comes without directions. There are no maps, and we are thrust into an unrecognizable emotional landscape in which there are very few familiar landmarks to carry us forward. At times, we become almost helpless in the face of our grief. Our familiar go-to strengths simply don't work. Hang in there, people tell us. Be strong. I think as we go along, the grief journey has less to do with strength than it does with our endurance and resilience. In the end, I think it's best simply to surrender to it, for there is no way out but through. We start out this journey thinking that grief is about the person we have lost, and certainly in the early days and weeks it is. Our love for our lost person doesn't disappear, and in some ways it deepens over time. But ultimately, the long journey of grief is about who we become as a result of our losses. It is a journey very much about ourselves. It has to be. We cannot withstand devastating loss without being changed by it. As we learn to grapple with and understand our grief, we are transformed, often against our own desires, sometimes against our better instincts. But we do eventually become different people. Hopefully, along the way, we come to realize that we are not alone in this, even if our grief often feels very private. I said at the beginning that I could not have spoken at last year's Lights of Life celebration. It was not only because of the timing of my own grief, but it was also in part because of the ceremony's association with Christmas. There's no other time of year than at Christmas when we naturally want more to be with friends and loved ones. But there's also no other time of year when people who are isolated, emotionally or physically in grief, feel most keenly the lack of the person they have lost, as well as lack of access to comfort, community, support, and love, the very things that could make grief easier to endure. This pandemic and this season of the year provoke us to acknowledge other tangible losses brought by the virus to everyone we know that are better recognized, talked about, demystified, and processed. But Christmas is also a holiday that embodies love. And if we are physically isolated at the holidays, or emotionally isolated in our grief, or solitary in our bubbles, we need to remember and try to embody the power of love. The love for those whom we have lost from this earth, the love for those who thankfully remain with us. We need to remember and think about others whose grief requires our loving response. And we also need to find ways to be gentle and give love to ourselves. We may not be able to gather to mourn in our traditional ways. We may not be able to rely on the balm of the holiday season to gather together and for others to comfort us in traditional ways. But we can use the meaning of this holiday to send out our own voices, our virtual hugs, and our messages of comfort through technology to others we know who are struggling with the ravages of grief. Our text, email, or phone call might just become the lifeline that gets someone through this season. Charles Dickens wrote of the meaning of Christmas that it should not live in our hearts only one day of the year, but in all the days of the year. We who are gathered together virtually today know well that grief also lives in our hearts all the days of the year. Let us look into our hearts at this season and as we move forward through the pandemic to remember that love and to manifest that love with the people in our lives and especially with the people who are suffering significant losses under the pandemic. And in that, I think we can find for ourselves no small measure of the comfort that grief requires.
All of us who've experienced grief have learned that there are many ways to honor our loved ones, infinite ways. Lights of Life offers one simple, meaningful way for you to remember the ones you've lost at this time of year. Lights of Life trees are located both in Whitehorse and in many rural communities. You can check the Hospice Yukon website and Facebook page for a full list of locations. When you visit a Lights of Life tree, you will find remembrance tags for you to write a few words or simply the name of your person and then hang it on the tree. You can also take home a tag to hang on your own tree. At our main location, the Elijah Smith Building in Whitehorse, volunteer tree sitters are there to talk with, if you choose, or just to be present. In addition to the regular Lights of Life trees, there are two special trees, the smallest of which is the child's tree. It's meant to remember the loss of a child, or it can be used by children to remember someone important to them who has died. The other is a pet tree. You'll recognize it by the dog bone ornaments. It's there to remember and honor a beloved pet that has died. We invite you to visit any of the Lights of Life trees, either in Whitehorse or in other communities, and hang a remembrance tag for each person or pet you wish to honor. Every year at this ceremony, we take a moment to do a blessing for the remembrance tags. This year, Hospice Yukon counselor Anne Macaire will read the blessing, followed by a poem read by Hospice Yukon volunteer Katy Delau.
A blessing of the tags. May all who come to remember and honor their beloveds who have died be blessed. May all who grieve be blessed. May these tags, which are a symbol of love, be blessed. May all who help to make this ritual possible be blessed. May all who offer support and care during difficult times be blessed. Our grief is an expression of our love. Blessings to each and every one of you as we journey on this path of love and loss together.
In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember them. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember them. In the opening of the buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the blueness of the skies and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. In the rustling of the leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember them. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick of heart, we remember them. When we have joys and special celebrations we learn to share, we remember them. So long as we live, they too shall live, for they are part of us. We remember them.
Thank you for being part of this year's ceremony for Lights of Life. I hope you are able to find comfort during this unique and challenging holiday season, coming at the end of a most challenging year. On behalf of everyone at Hospice, I offer you our warmest wishes for health, safety, peace, and joy in 2021. Now, please enjoy one last song from the Joy Waters Memorial Choir. Thank you again for joining us in spirit today.
free.